Russian President Vladimir Putin has once again become the center of global attention after delivering one of the most aggressive and controversial speeches of recent months. His latest statements regarding the war in Ukraine, NATO, and Western countries have sparked fears of a new escalation phase that could dramatically increase tensions across Europe and beyond. The Kremlin speech, delivered during a high-level security meeting in Moscow following a series of recent drone attacks and growing military pressure on multiple fronts, immediately triggered reactions from governments, military experts, financial markets, and international organizations. Analysts say the tone of Putin's remarks was noticeably harsher than in previous weeks, signaling that the Russian leadership may be preparing for a more confrontational strategy. In the near future, across Europe, news channels interrupted regular programming to analyze the Kremlin speech in real time. Political commentators described the atmosphere as deeply, while military experts warned that Putin's words could indicate preparation for broader military operations or intensified missile strikes. Putin accuses Ukraine and the West of crossing red lines during the speech. Putin strongly condemned recent attacks on Russian territory and Russian-controlled areas, accusing Ukraine and its Western allies of escalating the conflict to a dangerous level. The Russian president claimed that drone strikes targeting infrastructure and civilians inside Russia represented what he called terrorist methods. He insisted that Moscow would not tolerate further attacks and promised what he described as a serious and decisive response. According to Russian state media, Putin told military commanders that Russia must strengthen national security measures and prepare for all possible scenarios. He emphasized that the conflict was no longer only about Ukraine, but had become part of a broader geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. The West continues trying to weaken and destabilize Russia, Putin declared during the televised meeting, but Russia will never surrender its national interests or security. The comments immediately fueled speculation that Moscow may be preparing another major wave of missile and drone attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. Fear of massive new strikes against Ukraine. Military analysts quickly connected Putin's statements to recent increases in Russian military activity near the front lines and inside occupied territories. Some experts believe the Kremlin may launch a new large-scale air campaign, targeting energy infrastructure, transportation systems, and logistics hubs across Ukraine. Others fear Russia could intensify attacks on major cities such as Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa in an attempt to pressure the Ukrainian government and population psychologically. European intelligence officials reportedly warned that the next phase of the war could involve heavier use of ballistic missiles and long-range drone attacks, designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. Several Western newspapers noted that Putin intentionally avoided specifying what actions Russia may take next, leaving the threat deliberately vague. Analysts say this ambiguity is part of the Kremlin's strategy to create uncertainty and fear among both Ukrainian civilians and Western governments. Nuclear concerns return to global headlines. One of the most alarming aspects of the situation is the renewed focus on Russia's nuclear rhetoric. Over the past several months, Russian officials have repeatedly referenced nuclear-capable weapons systems while warning the West against deeper involvement in the war. Following Putin's latest speech, international media once again began discussing the possibility of nuclear escalation scenarios. Recent reports claimed that Russia used Oreshnik intermediate-range missile systems during strikes connected to Ukraine. Those missiles are believed capable of carrying nuclear warheads, even though no evidence suggests nuclear weapons were involved in actual combat operations. Still, the symbolism surrounding such weapons has intensified fears across Europe. Security analysts say the Kremlin uses nuclear messaging as part of a broader psychological strategy aimed at deterring NATO countries from increasing military support for Ukraine. Although Western intelligence agencies currently say there are no signs of imminent nuclear deployment, diplomats privately admit that continued nuclear rhetoric significantly increases global tension levels. Some experts warn that the constant references to strategic weapons risk normalizing nuclear threats in international politics, something many believe belonged to the Cold War era. NATO reacts with growing anxiety. Putin's speech triggered immediate concern inside NATO headquarters. Officials from multiple NATO countries accused Russia of deliberately escalating tensions and attempting to intimidate Europe through aggressive rhetoric. Emergency consultations reportedly took place among alliance representatives. Following the Kremlin speech, military officials discussed possible responses, including additional air defense support for Ukraine and increased monitoring along NATO's eastern borders. Eastern European countries expressed particular concern. Governments in Poland, the Baltic states, and other nearby nations warned that continued escalation creates growing risks for regional security. Some NATO analysts fear that accidental incidents involving missiles, drones, or border violations could eventually trigger a broader international crisis. At the same time, divisions within Europe regarding long-term strategy toward Russia continue becoming more visible. While some governments advocate stronger military support for Ukraine, others worry about the economic consequences of prolonged confrontation with Moscow. Moscow claims Russia is defending itself. Russian officials rejected international criticism following Putin's speech and argued that Moscow is acting defensively rather than aggressively. Kremlin representatives accused Western governments of fueling the conflict by supplying advanced weapons to Ukraine and encouraging attacks on Russian territory. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that NATO countries are becoming direct participants in the conflict through military aid and intelligence sharing. Russian state television channels dramatically increased anti-Western coverage after the speech. Programs described Russia as a nation surrounded by hostile powers attempting to destabilize and weaken the country. Political analysts monitoring Russian media said the Kremlin increasingly portrays the war as an existential struggle rather than a regional conflict. This narrative remains central to maintaining domestic public support. During prolonged geopolitical confrontation, Ukraine responds with anger. Ukrainian officials strongly rejected Putin's accusations and described the Kremlin speech as another attempt to justify future attacks against Ukrainian cities. President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of spreading propaganda while continuing large-scale missile strikes against civilian infrastructure. Kyiv insists that its military operations target strategic military facilities rather than civilians. Ukrainian authorities also argue that Moscow frequently uses dramatic rhetoric to distract attention from battlefield difficulties and economic pressure caused by sanctions. At the same time, Ukrainian officials acknowledge that Putin's speech likely signals further escalation. In the coming weeks, military commanders reportedly increased readiness levels in several regions following the Kremlin meeting. Financial markets react nervously. Global financial markets also reacted to Putin's comments. Oil prices rose sharply after the speech as investors feared possible disruption to energy exports and growing instability in Europe. Several European stock indexes declined amid concerns about security risks and economic uncertainty. Analysts noted that markets have become highly sensitive to major geopolitical statements involving Russia, especially when military escalation or nuclear rhetoric is involved. Energy traders closely monitored developments, fearing that future attacks on infrastructure or expanded sanctions could further impact global supply chains. The Russian ruble also experienced volatility as investors assess the possibility of additional sanctions or intensified military operations. China watches carefully. International observers noted that Putin's latest speech came shortly after renewed diplomatic contact between Russia and China. Chinese officials have continued publicly calling for stability and negotiations, while avoiding direct criticism of Moscow. However, Western analysts believe Beijing remains deeply concerned about the possibility of uncontrolled escalation involving nuclear threats or wider regional instability. Some experts argue that Putin's aggressive rhetoric is aimed not only at Western countries, but also at demonstrating strength to allies and strategic partners watching Russia's position carefully. The growing partnership between Moscow and Beijing continues worrying Western governments, particularly as global tensions rise. Russian society faces pressure and uncertainty inside Russia. Putin's speech arrives during a period of growing economic and social pressure, although state media continues projecting confidence and national unity. Independent analysts report signs of fatigue among parts of the population after years of sanctions, mobilization concerns, and international isolation. Economic challenges remain significant despite government efforts to stabilize key industries. At the same time, patriotic messaging and anti-Western rhetoric dominate Russian television and online media, reinforcing the Kremlin narrative that Russia is defending itself against external threats. Political experts say Putin's speeches increasingly focus on historical themes, sovereignty, and resistance against foreign pressure in order to strengthen public support. Social media explodes worldwide as clips from the Kremlin speech spread online, social media platforms across the world erupted with reactions. Supporters of Russia praised Putin for taking a hard stance against Ukraine and NATO, arguing that Moscow must respond forcefully to attacks on Russian territory. Critics accused the Russian leader of deliberately increasing fear and instability to maintain political control and justify future military escalation. Videos analyzing every phrase of the speech quickly gained millions of views on YouTube, TikTok, and X. Hashtags related to Putin, Russia, NATO, and Ukraine trended globally for hours after the broadcast. Political influencers, military bloggers, and international journalists all offered competing interpretations of what Putin's warnings might actually mean. Comparisons to the Cold War intensify. Many analysts compared the atmosphere following Putin's speech to some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. The combination of military escalation, nuclear rhetoric, sanctions, cyber warfare, and information battles has created a geopolitical climate that many experts describe as increasingly unstable and unpredictable. Several former diplomats warned that communication channels between Russia and Western governments remain extremely fragile. Others fear that repeated escalation cycles increase the risk of miscalculation or accidental confrontation between major powers. The psychological aspect of the conflict has also become more visible. Governments, media organizations, and intelligence agencies are all attempting to shape public perception while managing fears surrounding the war. Europe prepares for long-term tension. European governments are increasingly preparing for the possibility that confrontation with Russia may continue for many years. Defense budgets across Europe have already increased dramatically since the war began, and further military spending is expected following Putin's latest remarks. Several countries announced plans to strengthen air defense systems and expand military training programs. Civil defense discussions have also returned in some European states for the first time in decades. Officials privately admit that many governments no longer expect a quick diplomatic resolution. Instead, Europe appears to be entering a prolonged period of strategic confrontation with Moscow. The information war intensifies. Putin's speech also highlighted how important information warfare has become in the modern conflict. Russian and Western media presented completely different interpretations of the Kremlin statement. Russian outlets portrayed Putin as defending national sovereignty against Western aggression. Western media largely framed the speech as a dangerous escalation that could further destabilize Europe. This battle for public opinion has become a central part of the conflict itself. Experts say governments increasingly recognize that controlling narratives online and in traditional media can influence international support, economic confidence, and even military morale. What happens next? The biggest question now facing the international community is what Russia will actually do next. Some analysts expect another wave of large-scale missile and drone attacks against Ukraine within days or weeks. Others believe the Kremlin may focus on psychological pressure and strategic signaling rather than immediate escalation. Several experts warned that Putin's speech could also be connected to future political decisions regarding mobilization, military production, or expanded operations along the front lines. Diplomatic negotiations currently appear frozen, while mutual distrust between Russia and Western governments continues deepening. For civilians living in Ukraine, Russia, and neighboring countries, the uncertainty itself has become part of everyday life. Air raid sirens, military alerts, sanctions, cyber attacks, and constant geopolitical tension now shape daily reality for millions of people. As world leaders analyze every word from the Kremlin, and intelligence agencies monitor Russia's next moves, one thing has become increasingly clear. The conflict has evolved far beyond a regional war, and is now one of the defining geopolitical confrontations of the modern era. Putin's latest statement did not simply trigger another news cycle. It reinforced fears that the world may be entering an even more dangerous and unpredictable stage of global instability.